Okay, page 4, number 6 says Jacob drove 65 miles. This represents 80% of his entire trip. What is the total number of miles in Jacob's trip? So how many miles did he drive? He drove 65, right? He drove 65 miles, and then it tells us this number, this represents 80% of his trip. So this 65 miles is 65 is how many percent? How much percent? 80%. 65 miles is 80%. Then you see of after the percentage, right? So 65 is 80% of what? Of the entire trip. So let's use T for trip. So 65 is 80% of the trip, of T. So write this down in the box for number 6. That little phrase right there is going to help you write your mathematical equation to be able to solve for T, the total number of miles in the trip. So 65 means equals, here's my percentage. I'm going to write that as a decimal by dividing by 100 or moving the decimal 2 places to the left, so that's 0.80. Here's of means times in math, right? So I'm going to multiply by what? I'm going to multiply by T, the total number of miles in the trip. So here's my equation, 65 equals 0.80 times T. How are you going to undo the multiplication? You're going to divide, right? You're going to divide this side by the coefficient, which is 0.80, and you're going to divide this side by 0.80. Those 0.80 simplify to 1 times T, which is T. And so T, the total number of miles in the trip, is equal to 65 divided by 0.80, which is 81.25. All right, so that tells you the total number of miles in the trip. So your answer should be 81.25 miles. That is the total number of miles in the trip, and 65 miles was 80% of 81.25 miles. Okay, number 8. Number 8 on page 4 says what percent of 30 is 90? Okay, so what percent of 30 is 90? That's what it says, right? So first off, it says what percent. Isn't that your unknown? You don't know what percent, right? So can't you use a variable? Yeah, right? So let's use P for percent. What percent? We don't know, so we're using a variable. Here's of. What does of mean in math? It means multiply, right? So we're going to multiply. I'm going to go ahead and put parentheses to signify multiplication. P, what percent of 30, right? So P times 30. Here's is. What do I write for is? That's the equal sign, right? After the equal sign, I have 90. Okay, now this is P times 30, right? Because you have a variable right next to a number. How are you going to undo this multiplication? By division, right? I'm going to divide this side by 30 and this side by 30 because you always do the same thing to both sides. These 30s simplified to 1 because 30 over 30 is 1, and 1 times P is simply P. And so P is equal to 90 divided by 30. And isn't that 3? 90 divided by 30, that is 3. So P, our percentage, is equal to 3, right? But remember, this is a percentage. And how do you get a percentage? You take this number and you multiply by 100, right? Because percentage is out of 100. So 3 times 100 to get a percentage will give us 300%. 300%. So what we're saying here is that what percent of 30 is 90? Well, 90, isn't that triple of 30, right? I would have to take 30 and triple it or times it by 3 to get 90, right? And if you triple something, that's like taking 300% of it. If I take 300% of 30, or if I triple 30, I'm going to get 90. Okay, let's do one more. This is number 10. Okay, number 10 on page 4. Number 10 on page 4 says 650. 650 is what percent? Is what percent of 500? Okay, that's the question. So let's use that phrase right there to write an equation. So I have 650. 650 is, what am I going to write for is? That's your equal sign. Then it says what percent. I don't know what percent. That's my unknown, so let's use a variable. Let's use P for percent. Here's that's multiplication. I'm going to multiply by this number, by 500. So here's my equation, 650 equals P times 500. If I'm going to solve for P, I need to undo this multiplication here. So how am I going to get P by itself? Well, I'm going to divide by 500, right? I'm going to divide both sides by 500, so those 500 simplify, and so P, my percentage, is equal to 650 divided by 500, which is what? 1.3? Isn't that a decimal? Yeah, that's a decimal, right? And if I want to go from a decimal to a percent, from a decimal to a percent, I go to the right two spaces, which is the same as multiplying by 100. So 1, 2, my percentage would be 130%. Right? So 650, isn't that number bigger than 500? Yeah, it's bigger than 500. And so I would expect my percentage to be some percentage over 100, right? Because I'm taking more than a whole. I'm taking more than 500. I'm taking 650. So 650 is 130% of 500.